Hey Stan, thanks so much for joining me today to talk about tariffs. Everybody's quite worried about them, so I'm excited to talk with you.
Thank you for having me on, Kyla. Great to be here.
Yeah, so you wrote this paper called Trump's Tariff Formula Makes No Economic Sense. It's also based on an error. So could you talk through why you think this formula that Trump has used to calculate reciprocal tariffs is not economically sound?
Sure. So that's really the first part of the problem. The formula, what it does is it basically says for each country in the world, we're going to take the trade deficit, the U.S. trade deficit with that country, divided by total imports that the U.S. gets from that country. And then that percentage, we're going to call that the tariffs that that country imposes on the U.S. And then we're going to divide it by half, and those are the tariffs we're going to impose on them. Um, there's a number of problems with that. First and foremost, it is not obvious at all that having a bilateral trade deficit with a country is a problem. Um, Even if the U.S. had no trade deficit, you would still have trade deficits with some countries just because some countries produce certain things that we really like. Other countries consume products that we produce that they really like. And there's no reason to think that all of those trade balances should be at zero. Uh, in addition, there's no reason to believe that imposing tariffs on all sorts of countries is actually going to fundamentally change the overall trade deficit that we run. The overall trade deficit we run is much more determined by choices that we make between whether to save or whether to consume. And so, you can, of course, by targeting a specific country with tariffs, you can reduce the bilateral trade balance with that country, but then it'll just pop up somewhere else. So I think that those are a few of the sort of economic issues with the approach they've chosen. The approach they've chosen is also really at odds with international trade law. To the extent that people care about that, this is really not how retaliation works, for example, under international trade law.
Yeah, no, it all seems like to be based on a misunderstanding of what a trade deficit is. Like I've seen it compared to having a trade, you have a trade deficit with your grocery store, you buy things from them and they don't buy anything from you. And so could you talk a little bit more about, the savings aspect of this, like the other way that we would think about reducing the trade deficit, like savings versus consumption? I think that can get a little bit confusing for people.
Sure. So think of, so we're a country, we earn income, we produce stuff. And then we can do two things with it, right? We can either consume or we can save. And at the same time, there in the country there are investment opportunities, factories you can build, businesses you can start, and those are sort of two sides of one and the same ledger, because the investments that you can make, they all have to be financed, and that can be done either by our savings or by investments from abroad. Now, whether those investments are done with domestic savings or financial capital inflows from abroad, the total capital stock is going to be the same, because certain investment opportunities are going to be attractive or not. If we don't invest in them, someone from abroad will invest in them in an open economy like the U.S. where foreigners can invest. And so all that we control is whether our domestic savings are going to be greater or smaller than that total investment in the U.S. If our savings are smaller, that means that we'll have capital coming in from abroad to make use of the great investment opportunities in the U.S. As a counterpoint to that, we can then buy stuff abroad, because that money came in. Ultimately, in an accounting sense, it all has to be in balance. And so if a lot of people are investing in the U.S. because there are so many good investment opportunities, we are not investing in all of them ourselves. That's when we run a trade deficit.
And you also talked about the error that's in this calculation and kind of like the misunderstanding that happened there. Could you highlight specifically that error and what they got
Yeah,
wrong?
sure. So based on their logic about bilateral trade deficits, what they do is, as I said, right, for every country, they basically say, the tariff rate is going to be half times trade deficit divided by imports. Now, that sounds very simplistic. And so on Wednesday, after the announcement, when people had found out that that's what they really did, the White House and then the Office of the United States Trade Representative said, no, what we did is more sophisticated. And they put out a formula that is that same formula, except that it also has two Greek letters in the denominator. Those two Greek letters, they multiply them. One they set to equal to 0.25, one they set equal to 4. Of course, you multiply 0.25 by 4, the product is 1. And so those two Greek letters don't actually change anything. You're just dividing by 1. But they make a big deal out of it because they want to make it seem as if their approach is more sophisticated than it is. Now, for that 0.25 value in particular, they point to a paper and they say, that's where we got the paper from. This parameter is the elasticity of import prices with respect to tariffs. Basically, if a tariff goes up by 1%, by what percentage does the import price go up? And they say it's 0.25. In the paper that they cite, that number is actually is more like 0.95, so much higher, almost 4 times higher. I don't think this is really in dispute anymore. One of the authors of the paper so we put out our blog post on Friday. Yesterday, he published an op-ed in the New York Times confirming that they picked the wrong number. And so now remember this Greek letter is in the denominator. If you make that number 4 times bigger, of course, the division, the eventual tariff rate that you end up with becomes 4 times smaller. And so that's what we pointed out. It would imply dramatically different tariffs imposed on basically every country in the world that was above the 10% minimum tariff that they were imposing on everyone. In fact, there would be no country left with a tariff above 14%, even though the tariffs are currently planning on imposing go as high as 50%. And so it would be pretty dramatically different outcome. Now, as we discussed, I don't think the logic behind this formula or behind this whole approach is good. But, if you take them seriously, if you take their formula seriously and you do the calculations accurately, you end up with these much lower tariffs than what we're actually imposing.
And do you think like imposing those much lower tariffs would be better, or are you kind of like we should just have targeted tariffs? Like, how do you think about just the whole universal
I think
tariff
it'd be
stance?
better. I don't think it'd be good, but it'd be better than what we have now. And you can see from the market response to various rumors and statements over the past few days how many people agree with me on this. Like you probably saw on Monday we had this false rumor that Hassett had said that the tariffs would be suspended for 90 minutes. The S&P went up by like 6 percentage points within moments and back down again. Yesterday, when they were hinting at an agreement with Japan, you immediately had a positive market response, and so I think it would be much better. I mean, I think it would still be bad, but it would be an improvement over the plans that are currently on the table.
And when you see what they're doing with China, so I think it's 104% tariff on China. It's expected to go in tonight, April 8th at midnight, I believe. Like, how do you think about that? Sort of the calculation that went into that, the fallout that could cause?
I mean, I think it's a bit of an overstatement to say that there's a calculation that went into it because they just keep adding numbers upon numbers upon numbers. Wouldn't surprise me if it's 200 by the time they actually go in. I don't think that's a defensible approach either. Honestly, I think it'd be more defensible if they just said we're going to fully boycott China, as opposed to whatever this is. Of course, a different interpretation is that what they want to do, what they did during the first Trump term, is to come to an agreement with the Chinese government, where the Chinese government promises to buy more American goods. Right? That's what happened just before COVID. Trump has hinted at that. Maybe that's the eventual goal. Is that good? I don't know. It would reduce the bilateral trade deficit with the U.S., I guess, if the Chinese government decides to buy more soybeans. It would mean that our bilateral trade deficit with some other country would go up. That doesn't seem like a massive accomplishment to me. I thought that the deal that was struck during the first Trump term was pretty meaningless as well. And so if that is the best we can hope for, it's better, I guess, than 150% tariff, but it's still not a great outcome.
And a lot of people seem to think, or the administration has said as much, that the goal here is to restore domestic manufacturing. How do you feel about that argument? Like, do you think this is at all plausible to use tariffs to somehow bring manufacturing back to the States?
Yeah, I mean, I think they go back and forth on what they want to accomplish. I think some of them really care about revenue. Others want to use the tariffs to get policy concessions in other areas, right? Uh, but there's, there, as many people have pointed out, there's a big tension between, on the one hand, using the tariffs as a tool for leverage, which is sometimes how they talk about it, or, as a way to get to a different trade deal. And on the other hand, using the tariffs to raise revenue and change the industrial makeup of the U.S. Those goals are in tension. But I agree with you. Some people, for sure, think that this is a way to increase the manufacturing share of the U.S. economy. I mean, like you can do that, right? We can engage in central planning to some extent. I do think it's a misguided approach in general. Maybe there's some industries that we really care about for national security reasons, but in general, I think it's a bad approach for a number of reasons. First of all, it just makes us poor, right? The reason why some manufacturing takes place abroad is for reasons of comparative advantage in many situations. Second, I think there's a sort of misguided nostalgia about manufacturing. I think people have this image of relatively well-paid, strong men in steel mills in the 50s. That's first, and that's not what manufacturing jobs look like anymore. Second, those jobs weren't that pleasant, and certainly a lot less pleasant than a lot of the other jobs available now. And third, to the extent that some of those jobs were particularly well paid, it was often because those industries, those companies, were shielded from competition. And so, that makes some people better off, that makes the rest of the country worse off, right? It's just classic special interest politics. And so, for all those reasons, I don't think it's the right way to go.
Yeah, there seems to be this nostalgia that's driving it and a vast misunderstanding of what present day manufacturing looks like. And so when you think about sort of the economic damage that the tariffs could cause if they do go into effect, which seems what we seem to be barreling toward, how are you thinking about what that could cause?
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it for now, the damage is one, just distortions, in the decisions people make on what to buy, what intermediate inputs to use. Two, I think people will stop investing until it's clear what our future trade regime will look like. Right? You don't even get, I think, the compositional shift in sectoral output in the U.S. because who's going to build a factory when the trade regime could be completely different a week from now, a month from now, 2 years from now. So I think those are two negative consequences. And then thirdly, and maybe most importantly, there's just this massive disruption of supply chains and networks of firms and suppliers and end users of intermediate inputs that are being disrupted, and it's going to be very complicated and difficult to put those back together.
Yeah, it seems like the timelines for reshoring manufacturing, if that is possible, are a little bit unrealistic, at least what we've seen businesses talk about. Have you seen that as well?
Yeah, totally. That's my impression as well. Certainly for the
Yeah.
kind of manufacturing industries that they want to bring back.
Yeah, like the more complicated type of manufacturing.
Yeah, which of course don't employ that many people, but yeah.
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 It's, but like it also seems to be this idea that the United States has been getting ripped off, like the America First sort of ethos. How do you feel about that? Like the United States has been sort of subsidized by other countries for a long time. How are you thinking about this idea of Trump saying they're being ripped
Yeah, I mean,
off?
I think in the 1980s, he was very worried about the trade deficit with Japan, and he started to think that a trade deficit means you're running a loss and a trade surplus means you're running a profit. And it's just been impossible for him to understand how those things really work. Where you really see that people don't understand sort of the basic accounting of international economics is when you hear people say, sometimes in the same sentence, that they think the trade deficit should be smaller and we should have more incoming foreign investment. Those two things are at odds, just in an accounting sense, and yet you very regularly hear people state both of those things as objectives for American public policy.
Why do you think that is so confusing for people? Like why do people state it at the same time?
They don't take the time to learn. Like, they have
So
they have intuitions, and that's what it is. They just don't link the two because you don't. They happen on a macro scale, and so it's very difficult to to understand how they go just from thinking about the day to day.
How much of the issues that we're facing right now do you think is that like just people not knowing and not taking the time to know?
I mean, I think some of it. I think there's also just a political climate within the Republican Party that
Yeah.
makes it very difficult for members of Congress who do know better to vote in the right way, to be critical of these policies.
And you say probably most people would agree that protectionism doesn't always work out that well.
For sure.
Yeah. Is there any way that we can get past that, or is that kind of just an
Well,
ideological?
I mean, I would imagine the past week has helped.
Mhm.
I think as people start to see the consequences of these policies, I think they'll become a lot less popular.
And the policies haven't even gone into effect yet. So
Yeah,
when you think
yeah,
about that, like it, it could really
yeah, for sure. Yeah,
skyrocket.
for sure.
Yeah. This will be my final question. Just, you see a lot of arguments online that people are saying that this is really going to help the middle class. That it's a group that's been underserved for a long time. What are your thoughts on that claim? Like, do you see this at all working for anybody?
I mean, I'm sure there will be some people who work in industries that are going to be protected from foreign competition and that do not rely much on uh, inputs from abroad. That will benefit, right? And so you maybe some people who own firms in those industries or people who work at those firms, they may benefit. Certainly in the short run. I think in the medium run, even those firms, of course, you'd expect more American firms to enter those industries, and so even in the mid to long term, even those firms, I don't think will benefit that much. But in the short run, that's I think the people who will benefit.
Well, thank you so much, Stan. This has
Of
been
course,
super helpful for understanding what's going on. Yeah, thank you.
of course, happy to do it.